You ever have one of those moments, you get this massive promise, this incredible glimpse of what your future could be, and then bam, you're hit with a devastating problem. It's like this crazy whiplash, right? That tension between a huge promise and a gut-wrenching reality. We've all been there. Well, today, we're going to dive into maybe the most powerful example of this in all of history. We're talking about Joseph. His story, from a literal pit to a palace, is basically a masterclass, a blueprint for hope.
And really, the whole journey we're about to walk through is framed by this one powerful idea. This idea that you can be a prisoner of hope. I mean, think about that. Even when your life feels like a prison, you don't have to be a prisoner of despair. You can be held captive by the promise of what's to come. This verse right here from Zechariah, it's our anchor for this whole explainer. It's the lens through which we're going to see every single thing Joseph went through. So, for this deep dive, we're leaning heavily on some amazing insights from TestifyPod's original Testimonies series. And what they point out is so powerful. They say Joseph's story isn't just some ancient tale. No, it's a blueprint. It's a pattern that we see God use again and again, turning what looks like pointless suffering into powerful, sacred preparation. All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to break this down into 5 key parts. First, promise meets problem, that initial collision. Then we'll look at the presence in the pit, the one thing that never changes. After that, the purpose of the process, why it all had to happen. Then the big one, the power of divine perspective. And finally, we'll land the plane with your story, your application, making it all personal.
Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, Promise Meets Problem. This is that moment, that collision, where a divine promise smacks right into a very human, very harsh reality. So picture this. You've got Joseph, just 17 years old, and the promise he gets, it's huge. He has these wild dreams where his whole family, even the sun, moon, and stars are bowing down to him. It's a sneak peek of his destiny. And then the problem hits. Hard. In a shocking, brutal twist, the very same brothers from that dream, they throw him in a pit, and they sell him for 20 pieces of silver. I mean, in a single day, the dreamer goes from being the favorite son to just property. So you gotta ask, what in the world is going on? Was the promise a lie? No, not at all. And this verse from John's Gospel gives us the perfect lens to see it through. See, the promise, that dream, it wasn't being destroyed in that pit. It was being planted. Just like a seed, it had to fall into the dark, into the dirt, and die to what it was so it could grow into something way, way bigger. A harvest that would end up saving an entire nation. And check this out, because this pattern is so important to get. Joseph's story isn't a fluke. It's a recurring rhythm. Think about it. Abraham gets a promise of a son, then faces a barren womb. David is anointed king and immediately has to run for his life and hide in caves. Even Jesus, right after he's declared the Son of God, is immediately sent into the wilderness. You see, the problem after the promise isn't a denial. It's part of the development. So, how do you possibly survive that? How do you hold on? That brings us to Section 2, the presence in the pit. This is about the one constant, the one anchor in all of that chaos. So Joseph's a slave in Egypt. He's been stripped of everything, his family, his coat, his freedom, his name. It's all gone. But, and this is one of the biggest buts in the entire story, the Bible keeps repeating this one phrase, like a drumbeat of hope, but the Lord was with Joseph. That became his new reality. Not the slavery, but the presence. And just when you think it can't get any worse, it does. He does the right thing. He resists temptation from his boss's wife, and what's his reward? He's falsely accused and thrown into a dungeon. And yet, what do we hear again? That same exact phrase, but the Lord was with Joseph. The address changed, from a house to a prison, but the presence didn't. That was the constant. And listen, this presence wasn't just some vague, warm feeling. It was active. It's what gave him success. It's why he kept getting promoted, first in Potiphar's house, and then, get this, in prison. This is the key takeaway here. Joseph's success and his resilience didn't come from his circumstances, which were terrible. It came directly from God's presence with him. This verse from Isaiah just nails it, doesn't it? The promise isn't that you'll never walk into a fire. The promise is that when you walk through it, you won't be burned up, because he'll be right there with you. See, his presence doesn't always stop the trial, but it gets you through the trial. Okay, so this all flows perfectly into our third section, the purpose of the process. Because all those years of hardship, they weren't a detour. They weren't a distraction from the promise.
They were the curriculum. They were the training ground designed to build the man who could actually handle the promise when it came. You can literally think of it as heaven's training program. Lesson 1, servitude. In Potiphar's house, the young dreamer learned how to be a steward, how to manage things. Lesson 2, injustice. In that prison, he learned integrity, how to hold on to God's goodness when everything screamed that God had forgotten him. And lesson 3, waiting. Oh man, those long years of waiting. That's where he learned to depend completely on God's timing, not his own.
And I love how the Psalms puts it. Looking back on Joseph's life, it says, "The word of the Lord tested him." Think about that. The promise itself was the test. God's promises often have to test us before they can bless us. They have to shape us so we can actually carry the weight of what's coming. So what felt like a total rejection was actually a divine redirection.
All right, now we're at the turning point. This is the climax of the whole story. Section 4, the power of divine perspective. This is all about the massive internal shift in how Joseph sees everything that happened to him. And I absolutely love the way this is framed, the divine Uno reversal. So years later, Joseph finally comes face to face with his brothers. And he doesn't just jump to, "It's all good, I forgive you." No, he starts with just gut-level honesty. He looks them in the eye and says, "You meant evil against me." He calls it what it was. He doesn't sugarcoat it or pretend the betrayal didn't hurt like hell. He validates the wound. And then comes the pivot, maybe the two most powerful words in the entire story. But God. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Wow. That's the shift right there. That's the divine perspective that completely reframes everything, turning a story about being a victim into a story about redemption. And that's what we're calling the divine Uno reversal. You know, like in the card game, someone plays a card to hurt you, and God throws down a reverse card and uses their move for his plan. It's his sovereign power to take the absolute worst things people do, their evil intentions, and literally repurpose them for his good. And of course, the ultimate example of this is the cross, right? The greatest evil ever committed was turned into the greatest good the world has ever known.
Okay, so what does all this mean for you and me right here today? This brings us to our final and honestly most important section, your story, your application. How do we take this ancient blueprint and actually use it in our own lives? Well, the key seems to be this idea of active surrender. Notice, that's not passive surrender. It's not about just sitting around waiting for things to get better. It's about humbling ourselves under God's hand, trusting that His timing, His due time, is actually perfect. It's about choosing to be faithful right where we are, even if it feels like a prison or a dead-end waiting room. And you know, the incredible thing is, after all that waiting, the breakthrough can be unbelievably fast. We can't forget this part. After 13 long years of being a slave and a prisoner, Joseph went from the dungeon to being the prime minister of Egypt, literally overnight, in one night. It just shows you that when all of God's preparation finally collides with His perfect timing, a decade of process can turn into a day of promotion. So that leaves a pretty big question on the table for all of us, doesn't it? How can we start looking at the pits in our own lives, the disappointments, the betrayals, the long waits, and begin to reframe them through this lens? How can we start to see them not just as random, painful events, but as potential chapters in a story that God is writing for good? Because in the end, that's the big takeaway from TestifyPod's amazing look at this. Your story, your pain, your process, all of it is being woven into something so much bigger than just your own comfort or happiness. Your story is being written for His glory.